Welcome, Bruchim Habaim. I am Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and you have found your way to Beit Virtuali, Yasher Koach. Years ago, when I was somewhat regularly writing a blog, I couldn't figure out how people were finding it because, quite frankly, I didn't work very hard to get it out there. And after a little analytical search, I found out that people were typing into their search engine, what does Yasher Koach mean? Which makes sense. If you've never been to a synagogue before and you visit for a bar bat mitzvah, you're going to hear a lot of Yasher Koach, and I can imagine that being one of the things that rings in your ears as you come back from a service. Well, the simple answer is that it means, may your strength be firm. But what does that mean, and why are we shouting that all the time? Well, today, most commonly, you are going to hear it shouted in services when someone has read a passage from the Torah, or when someone has lifted the Torah or been called up to the Torah to say a blessing around it. Sometimes you will hear Yasher Koach shouted after a really good sermon, especially if it's being given by a bar or bat mitzvah student. And it's related to another thing that we shout out at the end of reading a book of Torah or completing the Torah reading of one of the books of Torah. We'll shout, Chazak, Chazak, V'nit Chazek, strength, strength, and may we all be strengthened, which I hope you can admit is a pretty cool thing to shout. But its origins are actually a little bit more interesting. According to Eliezer Zigal from the University of Calgary, back in the day, our Torah services were done a little bit differently. If you were called up to Torah, it meant that you were going to read the Torah scroll yourself. Not exactly the easiest thing to do, especially if you didn't grow up in the cradle reading Torah. But not only did you have to read it yourself, you have to hold the Torah up as you read it. And so it would make some sense that the people in the congregation would be shouting at you, Yasher Koach, may your strength be firm, because you don't want to drop the Torah scroll. But if this is something that we hear shouted, and in hearing that it's what remains in our ears, then maybe it's worth looking a little bit deeper into what this actually means. The words in Hebrew, Yasher and Koach, well, Koach is easy, it means strength, but what kind of strength? What are we actually wishing people when we shout at them? Because quite frankly, we've all needed or wished for a little bit more strength at some time. And on the other hand, we've all been on the receiving end of types of strength that are relatively unpleasant. So the word yashar is probably the key here. And when it appears, it means something very specific as an attribute for us as humans. We can use a key passage from the book of Deuteronomy that says, Ve'asita hayashar ve'atov be'enei Adonai, which means do what is right and good in the sight of the Eternal. Now, the sight of the Eternal, we're going to talk later on about what all these humanizing traits actually mean, what these anthropomorphisms mean. But this is a passage where Moses is talking to us after we have messed up yet again. Come on, that's why we read Torah. It actually is universal. Well, when we're coming back to the Eternal, the wish here is that we do it by acting, well, stronger, better, more righteous, more upright. Another aspect of it is actually, I'm even going to call it a name of God, or at least an attribute or an aspect of God. We have another passage also from the book of Deuteronomy that is, Hatzur tamim polo kichod derachav mishpat el emunah ve'en avel tzadik ve'yashahu. The rock, the deeds of the Eternal are perfect, yea, and all the ways of the Eternal are just, a faithful God, never false, true, and upright. So the shouting of Yasher Koach isn't just a random kind of strength. When we are actually wishing someone's strength, well, a teacher of mine once joked that the louder the Yasher Koach, the worse the Torah reading was. Now, that seems a little bit mean, but I think that there's another way to look at it. The other way to look at it is we are obligated to encourage people when they need most encouragement. At the same time, we acknowledge people who have done something really remarkable. And being called up to Torah, reading Torah, offering a word of Torah, these are remarkable things that we want to be stronger among us, stronger in society, stronger as a part of who we are. So let's go back to Chazak, Chazak, V'nit Chazek, what we say when we finish reading a book of Torah. Strength, strength, and may we all be strengthened. And when we put these two strengths together, Yasher Koach and Chazak, Chazak, we start actually getting an idea of what we're talking about here, and it's not inconsequential. You can't shout Chazak at someone in a Jewish sense and be wishing them destruction. You can't shout chazak at someone and be wishing them harm. This is about lifting them up, v'nid chazek, and in the process of doing so, lifting us all up. And if that seems really obvious, it's just not, because how many of us have had justified someone tearing us down recently when they have used strength against us and justified it because we needed correction? It's the modern version of the Vietnam War. We had to destroy the entire village in order to save it. And if that sounds a little bit dark, well, the way that we treat each other seems to be a little bit dark these days. It's all too easy to jump in here and say, well, what if we need to take someone down a notch in order to correct them? As if we're all some sort of orthopedic surgeons that have to break bones in order to make them stronger. And my answer to that is, who are we to make that decision on who needs to be torn down? There's a humility in Yasher Koach. The humility is that we really have a primary obligation as we go through life, and that's to be a mensch. And that means lifting people up and not tearing them down. And so Yasher Koach becomes a kind of test. When it's shouted at us, are we worthy of Yasher Koach? Is that which we're doing in that moment something that we wish to be strengthened and made firm? And if we are shouting at someone, are we encouraging something that should be made stronger among all of us? Put differently, what kind of life do we need to live in order to be worthy of having Yasher Koach shouted at us? So what is Beit Virtuali? Well, you've just seen a little bit of what it is. We start off with the proposition that Judaism is relevant. It's relevant because we are encouraged to constantly engage, and the second aspect, go deeper. That whenever we learn something, there's always something more that we could learn about it. And in the aspect of saying there's always something more to learn, we humble ourselves in a profound way to say, I don't know everything, which is not what we're being encouraged to say today. Beit Virtuali, for me, for all of us, is a constant question, a reflection on, are we worthy of shouting Yasher Koach and having it shouted at us? Are we in the process of lifting up or in the process of tearing down? And not only that, are we aware of when we justify doing really horrible things, thinking that we're lifting them up? So let's explore this together. Join us. You'll see more videos coming over the next weeks and months, as well as another video coming out soon that will describe more of what Beit Virtuali is, how you can become a member, how you can become involved, how you can support us. Thank you so much for being here with us. Treat each other a little bit better, and we'll treat each other better together.
עמך אהבת, אהבת עולם, בית ישראל, עמך אהבת. תורה ומצוות, חוקים, משפטים אותנו לימדת. תורה ומצוות, חוקים